Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
A Wall Street scandal with roots in Silicon Valley. Attorney General Jerry Brown charges a major investment bank with defrauding California pension funds. And powerful images of human suffering and dignity at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. And a Bay Area author visits Afghanistan in the wake of the disputed elections there. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Now a recap of stories from this week's news. California medical marijuana advocates applauded the Obama administration's policy to pull back federal enforcement in states that have legalized its use. Stopping short of holding Governor Schwarzenegger in contempt, a federal court set a 21-day deadline to reduce the state's prison population by 40,000 face a court-imposed plan. In San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors voted for legislation to require that undocumented youths be turned over to federal immigration officials only after a felony conviction rather than upon arrest. And Sun Microsystems in Menlo Park announced plans to lay off as many as 3,000 employees worldwide. Well, Enron, WorldCom, and predatory mortgage lending practices are now legendary examples of dishonesty in the business world. This week's fraud case filed by Attorney General Jerry Brown against State Street Bank and the insider trading scandal involving the Galleon Hedge Fund Group are the latest headlines raising questions once again about ethics and business. Joining me to discuss these stories, the zealous drive for profits and greed run amok are Stu Wu, reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Andrew Ross, business columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, and Professor Sally Bach from San Francisco State University's College of Business. Stu, tell us about Attorney General Brown's, well, I think he's really charging fraud in this case with the State Street Bank, right?
That's right. On Tuesday, Attorney General Jerry Brown sued State Street Bank, alleging that they had defrauded the two largest pension funds in California. Now, Brown says that over the course of 8 years, going back to 2001, State Street, which is based in Boston, illegally overcharged CalPERS and CalSTRS, which are pension funds for the state public employees and state teachers, for overcharging the two pension funds by $56 million for executing what are called foreign currency exchanges. Now, the specific allegation is that State Street was supposed to charge what is called the interbank rates at the precise time of making a trade for the pension funds. What Brown says State Street actually did was to charge them the highest interbank rate of the day. Now, the difference between the highest rate of the day and the rate at the time of the trade, that's usually less than a penny. But when you multiply that by tens of thousands of trades and billions of dollars worth of volume, that adds up to $57 million over the past 8 years.
Attorney General Brown is getting some kickback, though, from people in the financial world saying he's making a big fuss over a very small problem.
Yeah, when you think about $57 million, that's a fraction of the $330 billion portfolios that CalPER and CalSTRS combined have. And many are saying that, some people are saying that he's using this to build up publicity for what's expected to be his a shot at a third term at the governor's office. He's been raising money for his campaign next year, and everybody who follows politics expects him to run. And he was actually on CNBC to talk about this on Tuesday, and when asked if he was just trying to drum up support for his campaign, he got very defensive and completely denied that. But the interesting thing to note is that the next day, he did send that a link to that video to reporters, that video of him denying that he wasn't doing anything for political gain.
And the photo of him with a piece of paper over his face, trying to say he was closing down the interview. Andrew, your situation here in reporting on the Galleon hedge fund is different.
Yes.
The Attorney General is making a charge here. Now we're talking about insider trading. So first of all, explain it, and then what happened.
Insider trading, it depends who's making that definition, but essentially it's trading on information that is not public, that is proprietary. In other words, it's private, it should be privately held. It is often related to a public company's quarterly earnings. So if, for example, you pass on information from inside a company that you know about what they're going to report in their quarterly earnings to, say, for example, a hedge fund like Galleon, then Galleon can cash in and buy the stock ahead of time if the quarterly earnings look good, or short the stock if the earnings look bad, which is, in this particular case, for example, happened to Google. There was somebody who was associated with Google, an investment consultant who was working for Google, who passed on information to a go-between about Google's quarterly earnings, I think in 2006. The information went to the hedge fund. It was going to be a disappointing quarter. They short the stock, Galleon shorted the stock and made $9 million out of shorting the stock. That's an example of insider trading. And what a hedge fund can also do by playing the stock one way or another, depending on which way they think it's going to go.
There are tremendous pressures in that business,
yes.
right? Is that the reason why that we're hearing these stories of, and we've heard lots of them?
I think in good part it is. I think it's pressure. I also think it's to a certain degree hubris. In that what we know about the head of this hedge fund, Rajaranam, excuse me, the pronunciation is sometimes a little difficult, is that he was very much a sort of a king of the world, and really wanted to push his hedge fund and make his hedge fund as big as possible. At the same time, hedge funds have an enormous amount of money, and what they have to do is to get as much really good information, really reliable information from the best sources as quickly as they possible ahead of the game. That's what they're in the business of doing. So there is a thin line. The question is for Galleon and the other 5 alleged conspirators in this particular insider trading scam is, did these people know that they were crossing the line?
Well, we're going to come to that, but what are the Silicon Valley connections before we get to the issue about what...
The Silicon Valley connections are the targets of these trades. So, for example, Polycom, which is a video and teleconference company based in Pleasanton, they were one of the first stocks that we know about to have been subject to this insider trading. There was an employee who has now since, I believe, been indicted from, or at least has been, I'm sorry, not indicted yet, but has been laid off or put on leave by Polycom, who apparently fed information that got to Galleon about Polycom's earnings, which were good. So Galleon made a lot of money. Google, I've mentioned. Intel was another company where an employee fed information, again, to this fund, and the people made money. Advanced Micro Devices is another company, Sun Microsystems is another company. Those were the targets of some of these trades. Some of the alleged conspirators are from the Bay Area too.
Okay. Now let's move to what the real problem seems to be here is that people have seemed to have lost a sense of direction. So, Professor Bach, we want to turn to you. When is it crossing the line, and when is it being competitive, and how do we define it in this world that we see where there's such a pressure?
Well, it's an important question. So we certainly want to see risk-taking, innovation, creativity of the right type. And so the question really comes down to how do you get that right without crossing the line? And so I think it really boils down to transparency. And if you're transparent with what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, then you should run into no problems either from a legal perspective or from an ethical perspective. However, if something is hidden, if there is something that is lied about, if there's not full disclosure, then any kind of normal risky behavior or risk operation that a company may want to engage in does not give the opportunity to the investor, to the employees, to the general public to understand the potential consequences associated with that risk. So therefore, I think it's important to think about two elements or two aspects, both the individual element of ethics and the responsibility of the organization in terms of ethics. So individually, in business schools, we may not have emphasized the importance of the ethical component of Adam Smith's original kind of foundations of the free market system. And so he anticipated in his companion text that predated the publishing of The Wealth of Nations, the theory of moral sentiment. He anticipated that free market systems would destroy themselves if there was not a moral foundation accompanying that. So we need to make that clear. The second component is at the organization level, and ethics needs to come from the top. So the leadership needs to set the tone, set the values, live the values, and create an environment in which ethical questions can be examined.
Let me turn to our two reporters here. You report on the kinds of problems that we're talking about. Where do you draw the line in raising suspicion about whether the story you're reporting on has ethical I guess, endorsement by leaders or individuals or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you look at this State Street Corporation case, State Street is a huge bank. They handle business for a lot of companies, pension funds across the nation. And there seems to be, what Jerry Brown is saying is that this is a problem at the organizational level, that they're not doing this just to the 2 California pension funds, but as well to many of them around the country. So it seems to be systemic.
What do you say?
I think it depends a lot on, shall we say, the zeitgeist. I think a lot of these questions weren't raised, several years ago. I think they're much, much more important now. Questions have been raised in the past even about things that were sort of quasi-legal or perhaps legal or a little shady, backdating options, issuing new fresh options, in other words, giving corporate executives a leg up, or sort of, again, an ability to get rich that even their own shareholders don't really have. So I think more questions are being raised in this general atmosphere of, you have now a society in which the income gap in the United States is the largest since 1928. And so I think these questions are being raised now. So again, the way that you make money and the amount of money that's being made may be legal, but is it right?
And certainly in a situation like at State Street, where this occurred over 8 years, right? Quite a long period of time. Certainly if there had been a culture set by the leadership of that company where it was okay to question practices and whether they were the right way to do things, we would have seen somebody certainly noticed that the documents were not being time stamped, and somebody should have questioned that if the tone from the top allowed for that.
You mentioned maybe individuals and organizations perhaps losing their moral compass. What kind of role can government play? Would regulations requiring more disclosure and transparency prevented the 2 possible scandals that we're talking about tonight?
That's a great question. I mean, I think certainly government is seeming to play an increasing role and have a much greater interest, certainly, in its responsibility for regulation and involvement as a result of the failure of business organizations to monitor themselves and to effectively police themselves. So, of course, there will always be ways to get around rules, and those individuals and organizations that want to get around rules. So I don't think there's any foolproof systems. At the same time, we live in a democratic society that has values that support a free market system.
Yeah, and I was going to ask as our last question probably, what about the free market system? How does it survive all of this dishonesty, proven yet, or sometimes not proven, but just the feeling that there's dishonesty in business?
That's a really tough one. I think 2 things. I do think regulation is important. I think prosecutions and the law applied, because often the law is simply breached, but legal institutions, law enforcement isn't quick enough. I think that is beginning to change, but I think you're also right about the culture, and the culture not just from the top, because people will always squeeze through that culture, but also culture of people coming in to these companies and having perhaps a broader view of the world than just simply how quickly can I make $5 million.
And that still is an important issue, and that's what you all report upon. And hopefully that in the academic community there's going to be a lot more attention paid to this. So thank you very much, Stu, Andrew, and Sally. Well, share your thoughts at kqed.org/thisweek on my question of the week. Is Jerry Brown using his job as Attorney General to further his political career? Well, this week, charges of corruption and fraud played a large role in the debate over the deployment of more troops to Afghanistan. President Karzai admitted to irregularities in the August election and agreed to a runoff next month. Joining me now is the director of the Institute for Public Accuracy and author Norman Solomon, who visited Kabul a week after the election in August as part of a fact-finding mission. Welcome, Norman.
Hey, thank you, Bella.
What did you find once you were there? I mean, the election was over, people were talking about it, had not been quite right, so what did you find on the ground?
I found in Kabul a city that increasingly is becoming, again, acclimated to violence. And it really struck me that here in the United States, what we know about Afghanistan, or think we know about that country, is largely the result of a filtration process through the news media, usually mass media. Through information, half information, kind of, sort of accurate information, fed by Capitol Hill and the White House and the State Department. And I saw quite a contrast when we got off the beaten track at the Institute for Public Accuracy. We organized a small delegation, and we talked to officials. We went to an orphanage. We talked to UN agencies and independent journalists and Afghan ministry officials. But we also went, for instance, to a refugee camp. And to me, when we went to a place where 700 families that had been dislodged from southern Afghanistan had been living in many cases for 1 year in a very squalid facility, it's even a stretch to call it a refugee camp, in the capital of the country. And for instance, a 7-year-old girl named Guljuma, who told me about being awakened at 5 in the morning by U.S. bombs. She lost several family members and lost one of her arms. That was the last meaningful contact that she and her family had with the U.S. government.
We have some photographs from your trip there, and we'll be looking at them as we continue our conversation. But when you, even if you get to, you know, the very people that we read about from one step back, did you find that their impressions were totally different from what was being reported?
Well, I talked, for instance, to a lot of women at what we here might call a consciousness-raising group. There it was about the notion that you have human rights as a woman. You don't have to put up with being beat up in your home. You actually have a right to go out into the marketplace. And I asked them, what is most important to you? And coming back was a unanimous answer: peace. And I thought, in the United States, peace sometimes sounds kind of wispy, or to some ears sort of wimpy, but to Afghanistan, people there, it really is the necessary precondition. It is literally a lifeline, and that lifeline is not present, and to the extent it has been present to some degree, it is now fraying.
Are people concerned about the election and the election process there?
Almost across the board, and I did meet with a wide range of people. There was a view that the election on August 20th was engineered and operated for the benefit of the governments and populations and PR of Western Europe and North America. And it was known at the time that the Karzai government was inept and corrupt. Now, in the wake of the first round election, it's known that it's illegitimate, and people have concerns much more concrete. For instance, the fact that the United States is spending more than 90% of our tax dollars in Afghanistan for military purposes. And so, again, to the example of the refugee camp, the families that I met were getting no help from the U.S. government, even though they were made refugees by the U.S. military actions.
Do you think people there will welcome more troops if the president should decide to send them there?
Well, the best polling says about 18% of Afghan people want more U.S. troops sent. If there's a center of gravity, I believe, and this is borne out by the conversations I had, Afghans do not want more U.S. troops. There's a lot of visceral opposition to U.S. bombing that is killing civilians. I don't think Afghans on the whole want the U.S. troops to disappear overnight, but I think they want a timetable overall.
Do you think this next election will be a fair election?
I think that's almost going to be an oxymoron, given the conditions, who is running the election, the presence of war there. It ultimately, I think, is a show election. Unfortunately, all the signs tell us, I believe, being organized and pushed by the U.S. so that after it's held, scheduled, if it is held on November 7th as planned, then there will seem to be a glide path for further escalation from the Obama administration.
What did you expect to come out of this?
Well, in terms of the visit, I hoped to find human faces behind the statistics. And when I had read about U.S. spending ratios in Afghanistan, I thought, what is this in terms of hearts and minds? But I wanted to listen and talk to people. And frankly, I think I saw, much more even than I expected, a U.S. war effort where the wheels are coming off.
Well, the generals agree with you on that one. Thank you very much, Norman, for sharing your visit to Afghanistan. Well, renowned photographer Sebasti Salgado has traveled the world capturing images that illuminate the human condition. An exhibition of his photographs is currently at the new David Brower Center in Berkeley, and our Sparks production team went to see them.
I remember the first time I saw this picture, and it's just, as I have described, cinematic in its light and tonal range. And there's always, if you look deeply in his photographs, there's often mystery.
Ken Light, director of the Center of Photography at UC Berkeley, has studied and written about the photographs of Sebasti Salgado.
The young child looking down and the way that they're wrapped. And then, of course, one of the key elements is the mother on the left, her face turned away, but yet we see the light reflecting off of her face or part of the face, and the blankets. It's just an amazing, I want to say haunting photograph that in one photograph really fully describes the tragedy and the trauma that people had in the Sudan during the famine.
At the David Brower Center in Berkeley, the exhibition Then and Now presents a selection of photographs from decades of work by Salgado. Salgado has traveled the world, documenting manual laborers in his native Brazil and other parts of Latin America, as well as refugees from war, drought, and famine in Africa and elsewhere. He was trained as an economist, but in 1970, his wife Lelia gave him a camera, and so began his obsession with the black and white image. At a time when mass media values the single photograph, instantly transmitted, Salgado spends years on one subject, producing books of 300 and 400 images that are both epic and intimate.
People describe his work as, or his ability as being able to get inside kind of this circle that people normally have around them and don't often allow people in, and especially not photographers in.
When the exhibition opened, Salgado and his wife were interviewed at the center.
Many times people put the question, how you can work with so big misery around the world, because when you go to refugee campuses, people die, starvation is there, no food, nothing. But this is not misery. This is not misery. They live in a community of humans. they have, same if they have not many material resources, they have a lot of comfort of the others, a lot of hope, incredible dignity. When a person dies, this person will not die alone. They die inside a group that buried them, that cry for them, that protected them.
I think documentary photographers have tended to be social activists and have used their photography as a way of telling those stories and connecting with individuals or organizations, can use the work to help inform and often change the conditions in which they're witnessing. And Sebasti really comes from that kind of arm of the documentary movement.
Salgado often makes his images available to organizations working for social change, such as Doctors Without Borders. The Brower Center, which serves as a home for groups involved in environmental and social action, chose Salgado for its premiere exhibition precisely because his art is activist in nature.
We always felt like we needed ways to engage new people in activism. And in my opinion, the arts are the best way to inspire people to think about the world a different way. And usually, to me, artists are the people who are the observers. They step outside society and they point out things about our culture, our patterns that maybe we don't see, and then help us to think about living differently.
Salgado has been increasingly concerned with the connection between social and environmental problems. Through their project, Instituto Terra, he and his wife have been active in restoring the rainforests in the area of Brazil where he grew up. And his next project, called Genesis, deals with pristine landscapes and species that need to be preserved. While some question this new direction, others see the connection to his past work.
He's somebody who has charted human suffering and human rights abuses, as well as living on Earth in different ways with different resources. And so he's somebody who's making it completely evident that you can't separate social or environmental issues or challenges or healing.
The exhibition of Sebasti Salgado's work continues to the end of January. That's all for tonight. Be sure to visit our new website at kqed.org/thisweek. You can watch segments or complete episodes, comment on our stories, subscribe to our newsletter and podcasts, and share your thoughts on my question of the week. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Major funding for Spark Stories are provided by Diane B. Wilsey. Additional funding provided by the George Frederick Jewett Foundation, Helen Sarah Steyer, and Fred Levin and Nancy Livingston of the Shenson Fund.